So a couple weeks ago I made a video about Jeff the Killer. I thought that doing a literary analysis of that story would be interesting and kind of funny due to its reputation of not being a great story. And a lot of you guys seem to like that video. It's one of my most viewed videos ever right now, and I've had a lot of people request that I do the same thing for some other stories. Originally I was going to do Eyeless Jack because that story is kind of funny as well, but it's also really short and I wanted to make something a little bit longer. And then I saw someone suggest that I do the Russian sleep experiment, and I thought that would be a great idea since I have a similar experience with it as I did with Jeff the Killer. Now, to be clear, I think the story is written much better than Jeff the Killer, but I also think a lot of people view it through rose-colored glasses. I know I certainly did. Because while the story is perfectly serviceable, I think it has quite a few issues which seem so much more glaring to me now that internet horror has kind of stepped up its game. A reminder that the point of these videos is not to make fun of the original author. Everyone has to start somewhere, and it's not their fault that this story got as popular as it did. My hope is that by analyzing what does and doesn't work for a story like this that a lot of people like myself have nostalgia for, we can better understand what makes a great horror story so great. So if you are an aspiring author, especially a younger one, then hopefully you can learn a thing or two based on my literary analysis of the story. Also, I'm not like a professor or a professional writer or anything. I'm just a 26-year-old dude who reads a lot of internet horror and horror literature and just loves talking about it. Over the past couple years, I've started diving really deep into horror literature, and that's what kind of frames these analyses of these creepypasta stories. I think there are a lot of great creepypastas, but I also think the bar is kind of lower for internet horror versus like what I'd be reading in an actual horror novel. So I'm kind of viewing these stories through that lens and seeing what the difference is between the two kinds of writing and kind of where creepypasta might fall short and where that's made up for in things that I see in prominent horror literature authors. Remember to subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet. My goal is to reach 50,000 subs by the end of 2025, and I'm well on my way there. Thanks for all the support so far. But enough intro already. Let's get into my literary analysis of the Russian sleep experiment. If you came from my Jeff the Killer video, then upon starting this story, you might be a little shocked to see that it's written pretty competently. We don't have nonsensical grammar here. We don't have 13-year-old kids talking like mob bosses. We don't even have a thing of bleach. But despite that, the story is pretty ominous. One of the most famous aspects of the story is the image that has come to be associated with it. I'm going to show it on screen. I personally don't find it that scary, not like I do with the Jeff the Killer image. This image is actually a prop created by a visual effects studio back in 2005. It was not created for this story. It just ended up being associated with it for some reason. And I say this because I have run into quite a few people online who seem to think that the Russian sleep experiment was a real thing. It wasn't. While unethical and torturous sleep deprivation experiments have certainly taken place over the course of history, this particular experiment wasn't real. That should be kind of obvious due to the insane ending of this story, but I still thought I should clarify. I've just seen some people dismiss criticism of this story because they think it's real, so it can't be unrealistic, I guess. But anyway, onto the story. Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 15 days using an experimental gas-based stimulant. The first nitpick isn't necessarily something that the story gets fully incorrect, but it kind of bothers me. At this point in time in the late 1940s, Russia was part of the Soviet Union, and it would be for another 30 years. Now obviously these researchers could have very well been Russian, but I feel that it would have been more accurate to call them Soviet researchers since that's what they would have been. But that's a small nitpick. My bigger issue is one that is a fundamental problem with this story, and that is the length of the experiment. I won't spoil the ending for you guys right now, but some crazy things happen, and the story wants us to believe that it's because these people have been pushed beyond their limit. Specifically, this story wants us to think that being awake for 15 days is something that is so far beyond what humans could be capable of that no one has ever seen the results of this before. But in 1986, Robert McDonald stayed awake for a record-breaking 18 days, 21 hours, and 40 minutes. That's obviously an extreme case, and most people wouldn't be able to do that. And staying awake for more than a couple days can cause hallucinations, hysteria, and even brain damage. It's not healthy for you at all. But someone has been awake for longer than 15 days and survived and didn't end up in the same fate that these people do in this story. I think if this story had pushed the time period out to something crazy like 2 or 3 months, then what we end up seeing could be a little bit more believable. And I get that this is just a story, that it's fiction, but it also presents itself as realistic and has that reputation among a lot of internet horror fans, so I think it should be called out. They were kept in a sealed environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake so the gas didn't kill them, since it was as toxic in high concentrations. This was before closed-circuit cameras, so they had only microphones and 5-inch thick glass porthole-sized windows into the chamber to monitor them. We get our first writing and grammar quirks here, and I want to preface that we do not really know who wrote this story, so English could very well be their second language. It could also be that this story was written in a different language and then translated into English later on. So some of these quirks could be attributed to that, but either way, they should be addressed so that we can understand why some of the phrasing here is awkward. And again, I'm not making fun of anybody who English might not be their first language. English is my first language, and I mess up stuff all the time when I'm recording my videos. I speak Spanish for a second language, and if this is really somebody's second language, this story right here, then their English is far better than my Spanish has ever been, even when I was living in Mexico. But back to the story. First, we have that the windows are described as being 5 inches thick, using the numeric symbol for 5 instead of writing out the word. And this isn't necessarily a flaw in and of itself, but the numeric symbol wasn't used earlier in the paragraph when they wrote 15 days. It's just neater to use one or the other and not both unless you're talking about like a year or a date or something that would be a long thing to write out. And this is an issue that shows up all throughout the story. I'm going to be putting the text up on screen as I read, and you'll see all of the different instances of them kind of mixing those two things with the numeric symbol and the written word. I'm not going to be pointing it out every time, but I thought it was important to emphasize that consistency in that little aspect makes the story just feel a lot neater and more professional. Also, so they had only microphones isn't technically incorrect as well, but it sounds a little awkward to me personally. I think so they only had microphones just flows a lot better. Again, it's not technically incorrect and would work if the overall tone of the writing in the story was more formal, but it constantly shifts between formal and informal. This is another trap that a lot of amateur writers fall into. It's okay to write a story where the narration sounds kind of informal. That's not a sign of weak writing at all if it's done correctly. I just finished reading My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones, and there was a lot of informal narration in that story that works because it keeps a consistent tone. But sometimes inexperienced or younger writers will try to insert phrasing they think sounds proper, and it ends up making the story sound more sloppy and less professional overall. Also, another nitpick, but closed-circuit cameras had been invented by the late 1940s. They were invented in 1942 and were first commercially available in 1949. It would be more accurate to simply say the researchers didn't have access to them, but also not every reader is going to be as obnoxiously focused on the details as I am, so it's not a huge deal. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep on but no bedding, running water and toilet, and enough dried food to last all 5 for a month. Again, we see 5 written out, which breaks the precedent set in the sentence before. It should also be running water and a toilet instead of just running water and toilet. I also find it a little odd that the prisoners are given books. I don't believe it's ever explained, and it feels a little strange to give them that comfort but then deny them their bedding. Now, obviously, the purpose of the experiment is to keep them awake, so not giving them any bedding makes sense, but the gas seems to be taking care of keeping them awake just fine. It feels like the books are kind of just shoehorned in there because the writer needs to address an issue that's going to crop up later when it comes to observing the test subjects. The test subjects were political prisoners deemed enemies of the state during World War II. Everything was fine for the first 5 days. The subjects hardly complained, having been promised falsely that they would be freed if they submitted to the test and did not sleep for 30 days. So I know I talked earlier about how the timeline is off in this story because they shouldn't be going nuts after only 15 days with no sleep, but now it's kind of off in the opposite direction. Not sleeping for 5 days will seriously mess you up. These subjects should be kind of losing their minds at this point, or at least begging to sleep. Describing everything as fine is a little odd. Their conversations and activities were monitored, and it was noted that they continued to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their past, and the general tone of their conversations took on a darker aspect after the 4-day mark. It would be nice to be let in just a little bit on what these conversations were about. I talked about this in the Jeff the Killer video, but keeping things vague so as not to spoil the big reveal is a tricky task. You don't want to give away too much because then the reveal feels kind of obvious, but you also don't want to give any clues as to what's going on because then it just makes it feel like the reveal comes out of nowhere. In this case, it feels a little strange that we aren't told what they were talking about since this is an experiment and it's presented in somewhat of a clinical way. The ambiguity just feels out of place. After 5 days, they started to complain about the circumstances and events that lead them to where they were and started to demonstrate severe paranoia. The word "and" is used in quick succession in different contexts, which makes it feel like the flow of the sentence needs to be broken up for more clarity. They stopped talking to each other and began alternately whispering to the microphones and one-way mirrored portholes. Oddly, they all seemed to think they could win the trust of the experimenters by turning over their comrades. the other subjects in captivity with them. There should be a comma after oddly and a colon after comrade, since what comes after is a related clarification of what came before. The word experimenters also sounds kind of off to me. It's not a made up word or anything, but researchers feels like it would fit a lot better here. At first, the researchers suspected this was an effect of the gas itself. Okay, so the word researcher wasn't off the table in the first place, but that just makes the use of the word experimenter feel even more out of place. After 9 days, the first of them started screaming. He ran the length of the chamber repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. He continued attempting to scream, but was only able to produce occasional squeaks. Another instance of a numeric symbol being used instead of the word in the same sentence that the word was already used for a number. Also, there should be a period after 3 hours straight. This is totally a personal nitpick, but I also think that the phrasing of occasional squeaks takes my mind out of the horror that this story is trying to set up. It just makes me think of Mr. Krabs' squeaky boots. Also, a fun fact that most people know, but the Squeaky Boots episode of SpongeBob is a parody and homage to The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, which makes that episode so much funnier in my opinion. The researchers postulated that he had physically torn his vocal cords. Well, thank heavens he didn't metaphorically tear his vocal cords, I guess. The most surprising thing about this behavior is how the other captives reacted to it. Or rather, didn't react to it. I see that the author is trying to put some dramatic tension in the way that they phrase the sentence, but it feels a little out of place in a report that has sounded pretty clinical up to this point. They continued whispering to the microphones until the second of the captives started to scream. The two non-screaming captives took the books apart, smeared page after page with their own feces, and pasted them calmly over the glass portholes. The screaming promptly stopped. So did the whispering to the microphones. So here is where things start to get a little weird. The captives calmly pasting the pages onto the windows is kind of a strange plot point to me. This is done so that the researchers won't have a view of the inside of the chamber, but why wouldn't they just go in and remove the pages along with the books? They haven't signaled that this is an experiment that cannot be touched by anyone on the outside for fear of tainting the results, and it just seems like someone should intervene at this point. Also, the paragraph break for the single sentence of "so did the whispering to the microphone" strikes me as pretty out of place. Those paragraph breaks can be done with great effect when the single sentence is something unusually eerie or shocking, something that we haven't been expecting. The screaming stopping and then the whispering stopping isn't that extraordinary of an event to warrant this unusual formatting. It feels like it's just giving unnecessary weight to a pretty standard detail. We know that the screaming stopped, so the whispering stopping seems like a totally normal thing that would happen. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure they were working, since they thought it impossible that no sound could be coming with 5 people inside. It should probably be no sound could be coming from any of the 5 people inside. It just sounds neater and a little bit less confusing that way, but again, it's not technically an issue with the writing. Also, the way that the sentence starts with "after 3 days passed" makes it seem like they weren't checking the microphones hourly during those 3 days. It should read "over the next 3 days" or "during the next 3 days of the experiment." The oxygen consumption in the chamber indicated that all 5 must be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen 5 people would consume at a very heavy level of strenuous exercise. In fact, should probably be replaced with "however." This should be a subversion of what we expect from the subjects inside, and the language doesn't properly reflect that. On the morning of the 14th day, the researchers did something they said they would not do to get a reaction from the captives. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke any response from the captives they were afraid were either dead or vegetables. So here we established that the researchers were determined to not interfere with the experiment, but it's kind of too little too late. This should have been established at the top of the story. Also, they say that they were afraid that the prisoners were either dead or vegetables, but we were just told that their oxygen consumption showed they were doing very heavy exercise. And I'm no scientist, but I would doubt that you'd get a comparable level of oxygen consumption from heavily exercising to being dead. They announced, "We are opening the chamber to test the microphone. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom." This is a run-on sentence. There should be a period between microphones and "step away." This is a common issue in a lot of internet horror stories that I've noticed. Also, "step away from the door and lie flat on the floor" is a certified bar. You'll notice that a lot of professional writing will stay away from rhyming as if it was the plague. That's because rhyming is something that all of us can recognize almost immediately, and it just kind of takes you out of the story. But in general, whenever a story is building up to a creepy moment or in the middle of something crazy happening, the grammar just starts to take a serious hit. And I think that's due to the author being just excited. I do the exact same thing when I'm writing my video scripts. When I'm getting to a moment in the story that I'm excited to talk about, or a point that I'm excited to make, my writing just gets worse. It's honestly kind of endearing to see internet stories like these though. It just shows that the author was so stoked about what they were writing, and I think that's pretty cool to see. But I am legally obligated to call it out, so that doesn't mean I can let it slide. Sorry. To their surprise, they heard a single phrase in a calm voiced response. We no longer want to be freed. The beginning of the sentence is written really awkwardly. It should read something like, to their surprise, they heard a calm voice respond with a single phrase. But despite the janky writing, I actually think this might be the best part of the entire story. I think this line is legitimately pretty creepy and it creates a lot of intrigue into what is actually going on. This is the kind of line that actually could deserve its own paragraph break. It recontextualizes the story going forward and flips the dynamic of the prisoners and the researchers on its head. Debate broke out among the researchers and military forces funding the research. Unable to provoke any more response using the intercom, it was finally decided to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. Another case of a missing comma, there should be one after using the intercom. Also, it's kind of strange to say that the military forces are funding the research and not just like the military or the government. Saying military forces makes it seem like the actual soldiers are all like pitching in a few dollars or rubles or whatever to keep this weird experiment going. The chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and filled with fresh air, and immediately voices from the microphone began to object. 3 different voices began begging, as if pleading for the life of loved ones, to turn the gas back on. It should read as if pleading for the lives of their loved ones, or as if pleading for the life of a loved one. That's a pretty small nitpick though. The chamber opened and soldiers sent in to retrieve the test subjects. Should be, and soldiers were sent in instead of just soldiers sent in. They began to scream louder than ever, and so did the soldiers when they saw what was inside. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although no one could rightly call the state that any of them in life. More weird phrasing here. It should read, no one could rightly call the state that any of them were in life. It's really interesting to see just how much a single word can impact the readability of a sentence. It just shows to go you that all of these tiny details really do matter in the long run. You can have a really great, really creepy idea for a story, but if the reading experience is bad, then the impact of everything is lessened. Also, if you've read this story before, can you believe that I'm less than halfway through the story? We're like a third of the way through it right now, which is kind of crazy to me. When I reread this story for my creepypasta iceberg video, I was shocked at just how much the last portion of this kind of drags on. I remembered it ending pretty quickly after they opened the chamber, but maybe that's just me. That was just the way that I personally remembered it. The food rations past day 5 had not been so much as touched. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subjects' thighs and chest stuffed into the drain in the center of the chamber, blocking the drain and allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. Precisely how much of the water on the floor was actually blood was never determined. I'm not going to lie, this is kind of where the story starts to lose me. I think that it starts to get really over the top here, and it ruins any of like the mystique that the story had beforehand. I get that this story is eventually going to reveal to us that something kind of supernatural is going on here, but the extreme violence feels like it's just trying a little too hard. Extreme violence in stories can work really well if it's done right. I personally love the legendary horror author Clive Barker, and he has a lot of insane violence in his stories. And we're talking about a guy who wrote a story where a dude gets held down and then the spirits of the dead come up and carve into like his flesh, like on literally like every centimeter of his body, stories of like evil and creepy things. It's insane. But like in this story, simply saying that one of the test subjects has been ripped apart and that very specifically chunks of his thighs and chest are stuffed into the drain just feels a little like edgy to me, but maybe that's just me. All 4 surviving test subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies. The destruction of flesh and exposed bone on their fingertips indicated that the wounds were inflicted by hand, not with teeth as the researchers initially thought. So again, I know the story is going in a paranormal direction, but I actually think this scenario could work really well if the prisoners were simply not given enough food to begin with. Being brought to the point of such desperation by enemy military scientists that you have to eat each other and yourselves in order to survive is super eerie and could actually conceivably happen. And I get that this story wants all of this crazy stuff to happen because the test subjects weren't allowed to sleep, but again, I think it just goes too far with the violence too fast. Closer examination of the position and angles of the wounds indicated that most, if not all of them, were self-inflicted. We're missing a comma again after most, and also it seems a little strange that they would be able to tell that these were self-inflicted just by the position and angles of the wounds. If your fingertips have been eaten away, then I imagine it would look the same whether you did it or someone else did it. There isn't really an angle that you can get to your fingers with your other fingers that someone else couldn't get to, but I'm not an expert on that at all. I took 2 semesters of biology in college and I didn't even get to anatomy. I just learned about cells and metabolism and the Krebs cycle. So far, this violent turn the story has taken just feels a little over the top for my taste, but honestly, it still feels like it could happen. It feels relatively grounded, but that's all about to go out the window now, so buckle up. The abdominal organs below the rib cage of all 4 test subjects had been removed, while their heart, lungs, and diaphragm remained in place. This is such a petty little nitpick, but it specifies that all the organs below the rib cage were gone, and then it lists the heart and the lungs, which are both organs, but then it mentions the diaphragm, which is a muscle, and it feels like the story is incorrectly labeling the diaphragm as an organ, even if that's not what the author truly intended. Google is telling me that the diaphragm separates the thorax from the abdomen, and fun fact, my brothers and I played Dungeons & Dragons for like a week when I was in high school, and my character name was Thorax Abdomen. It's honestly a great character name, still up for the taking for any of you Dungeons & Dragons players. Just might be something to keep in mind. The skin and most of the muscles attached to the ribs had been ripped off, exposing the lungs through the rib cage. All the blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just been taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the subjects. The digestive tract of all four could be seen to be working at digesting food. It quickly became apparent that what they were digesting was their own flesh that they had ripped off and eaten over the course of days. I'm going to level with you guys. This is where the story fully loses me. It's just too graphic and violent and gory to the point of being kind of silly. I talked about this in another one of my videos, but there is a sweet spot when it comes to violence in media where it is really shocking and horrifying and effective. Sometimes going over the top with it can end up being fun. I would consider the Terrifier movies so gory and disturbing that they wrap back around to being funny and a good time, at least to me. The Exorcist, both the book and the movie, but mostly the book, uses violence very effectively. We are watching a little girl get possessed and start to mutilate herself, and it's shocking. The book builds up just how sweet this little girl is for a while, and then the worst things ever start to happen to her. The movie does this well, and the medical scenes in particular are hard to watch in my opinion, but in most cases, the book just does it a lot better. When I was reading that book for the first time, I had seen the movie before, but I was like reading the beginning, and I was like, man, Regan and her mom just have like the most sweet relationship ever. I'm loving this. I'm really enjoying this. And I would like look at the cover of the book and be like, I forgot what I was reading. This is about to be horrible. The Exorcist 3, one of my favorite horror movies of all time, has moments of shocking violence that are never shown to the viewer, but are described in detail, and they're actually really creepy in my opinion. Much like in this story, the violence perpetrated by the villain is impossibly precise and brutal, but it works because the story has been established as having that element of fantasy. All of this to say that these guys pulling all of their organs out and spreading them across the floor without damaging them is just ridiculous and not scary at all. It's too delicate and intricate. The idea that none of the blood vessels are damaged is insane. I once had a buddy in high school get involved in an accident involving a window pane, and I'll tell you right now that it's pretty hard to keep all those insides intact when they're on the outside all of a sudden. He's totally fine, by the way. He made a full recovery and everything, and is now happily married with 2 cats, but that's all besides the point. I think that this insane violence could have maybe worked if we had seen that like 3 of the test subjects had already died by having their insides pulled out and spread across the floor, and each of them could have been further along in the process before they died until the final one managed to complete this impossible task. And seeing that like obsession and progress and like this work to perfect this weird, bizarre ritual they're doing could be kind of freaky. But as it is, it just feels way too edgy and over the top, and also really makes me wonder why there was a vocal contingent of people that think this is a non-fiction story. Most of the soldiers were Russian special operatives at the facility, but still many refused to return to the chamber to remove the test subjects. They continued to scream to be left in the chamber and alternately begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on, lest they fall asleep. Now, you may be thinking the term lest they fall asleep sounds kind of out of place, especially if we're to believe that that's what the test subjects are saying. But later on, we'll get a really good example of their flowery language that they seem to have adopted after tearing all of their organs out and laying them across the floor. Also, the way that the end of the first sentence and beginning of the second sentence is written makes it seem like the soldiers are the ones screaming. It should probably say the subjects continue to scream instead of just they continue to scream. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put up a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. So we're about to be told what these test subjects did to the soldiers, and keep in mind that they are literally laying on the ground with their insides all over the floor. To think that they would be able to put up any sort of resistance is kind of insane. If one tries to attack you, first, how are they even going to do that with all of their organs all over the place? And second, why don't you just like sever one of their blood vessels that's just hanging out on the ground next to you? Just stump on an artery and that's that. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out. Another was gravely injured by having his testicles ripped off and an artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. Was the second dude just like freeballing it? I imagine they have military gear on, and I can see someone getting their throat ripped out since that's kind of exposed, but how is one of these like feeble husks getting to your balls? Also, you probably don't need to keep specifying that they're Russian soldiers. It's pretty clear at this point, and also they should be Soviet soldiers, but I already talked about that. Another 5 of the soldiers lost their lives as you count the ones that committed suicide in the weeks after the incident. I'm not someone that thinks that you can't talk about suicide or self-harm in media. I think if it's explored well and not used for shock value, then it can be very impactful in a story. I mentioned that I just finished reading My Heart is a Chainsaw, which deals with self-harm, and I thought the book handled it really well, and it played into the story in a very tragic but fitting way. But just casually mentioning that 5 soldiers offed themselves after seeing these test subjects is kind of insane to me. I know that sometimes people take their own lives after traumatic events, and to be fair, most of these soldiers have probably seen combat and are dealing with PTSD, but the story doesn't talk about any of that. It just makes it seem like witnessing these events was the sole reason that they ended their lives. It's another example of the story trying to be scary and edgy, but just coming off as trying way too hard, and maybe I'm a terrible person, but I totally laughed when I read that line again. Not because I think that subject matter is funny or a laughing matter, I don't think that at all, but just because of course, a story that is trying to be so grotesque and freaky would just like casually throw that in there. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured and he bled out almost immediately. The medical researchers attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of a morphine derivative and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arms of one doctor. I think using the term bled out is kind of a strange choice if the test subject isn't actually dead yet. It would be more accurate to say that he lost most of his blood or a lot of blood. Bleeding out is just almost always used to refer to someone dying from blood loss. Also, morphine is a painkiller and not a sedative, so trying to sedate him with morphine isn't really accurate. Again, it would be nice to have been given some sort of explanation as to how these subjects are being transported given their current organs on the outside of their body situation. If we were told that they have been trying to put the organs back and that they were being attacked by the test subjects who resist, that could be pretty cool, but it's just hard to picture that situation right now. When heart was seen to beat for a full 2 minutes after he had bled out to the point that there was more air in his vascular system than blood. This entire sentence is kind of awkward and gives credence to the theory that this was written by someone who didn't speak English as their first language, or that this is a poor translation of a story originally written in a different language. It should be when the heart or when it's heart instead of just when heart, but the problem actually goes beyond that missing article. Starting the sentence with when makes the reader assume that there is some sort of cause and effect scenario that is about to happen. Something like when his heart was seen to continue beating for a full 2 minutes after he bled out, the researchers discovered there was more air in his vascular system than blood. It just sounds a lot more proper that way, and again, using that word when makes you think there's going to be like a cause and effect or some sort of reaction. Even after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone in reach and just repeating the word more over and over, weaker and weaker, until he finally fell silent. Nothing too much to say here, but it might help to clarify at the beginning of the sentence that it is referring to the heart beating, even after his heart stopped would be much less confusing. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2 with intact vocal cords continuously begging for the gas, demanding to be kept awake. A good example of why commas are important. The end of that sentence makes it seem like the prisoners are demanding for a sentient gas that is demanding to be kept awake. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room that the facility had. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back within his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative they had given him to prepare for the surgery. This is kind of a double clarification since we know that the test subject that died a little bit ago was also immune to being sedated. He fought furiously against his restraints when the anesthetic gas was brought to put him under. He managed to tear most of the way through a 4-inch wide leather strap on one wrist, even though the weight of a 200-pound soldier was holding that wrist as well. I have been confused about this since the first time I read this story. What is the soldier doing to hold the subject's wrist using all of his body weight? Is he like laying on his wrist? I get that the subject is supposed to be so strong that he's like pulling his wrist through the restraint, but the phrasing makes the situation really hard to picture, at least for me. It took only a little more anesthetic than normal to put him under, and the instant his eyelids fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. This has always been an interesting aspect to this story that I don't think I would call a mistake. The fact that the subjects are immune to the sedatives but not the anesthetic is kind of strange. You'd think it would be the opposite, that they could be sedated and calmed down but never put to sleep. It's interesting that they specify it only took a little more anesthesia than normal to put him under. The whole like dying after being put to sleep thing doesn't bother me at all. It kind of makes sense with where the story is going and what these test subjects are becoming. In the autopsy of the test subject that died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had triple the normal levels of oxygen. I don't understand this detail. They mentioned the other test subject had mostly air in his vascular system. Is this supposed to be spooky? I really don't know much about blood oxygen levels, so maybe I'm just missing something here. His muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in his struggle to not be subdued. Most of them were from the force his own muscles had exerted on them. The second survivor had been the first in the group of 5 to start screaming. His vocal cords destroyed, he was unable to beg or object to surgery, and he only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when the anesthetic gas was brought near him. We're missing another comma after vocal cords. Alternatively, you could write, with his vocal cords destroyed, he was unable to beg or object. I find it a little strange that this test subject is unable to object and just seems to kind of like meekly take being operated on when these test subjects literally ripped a dude's balls off a few hours ago. The story can't quite decide whether it wants these subjects to be savage, violent monsters, or tired, quiet victims that want to remain awake at all costs. It just feels inconsistent with itself. He shook his head yes when someone suggested reluctantly that they try the surgery without anesthetic, and did not react for the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon presiding stated repeatedly that it should be medically possible for the patient to still be alive. I'm like 99% sure it should say medically impossible. It would be weird for the surgeon to just be repeating that undergoing organ replacement surgery with no anesthesia is totally medically possible. One terrified nurse assisting the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. I don't know why you're so terrified, honestly. This sounds like the start of a beautiful love story. He only smiles when his eyes meet yours. When the surgery ended, the subject looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling. Some more awkward phrasing. That last part should probably be something like struggling to speak. Attempting to talk while struggling implies that the subject is thrashing around, which could be the case, but there have been enough grammatical issues in the story thus far that it's kind of hard to give it the benefit of the doubt. This is another concept that a lot of people might not realize they recognize when they read a story or watch a movie or experience any kind of media. Writing something very professionally gives you the benefit of the doubt when you write something that is awkwardly phrased because it feels deliberate in its construction and placement. I'm currently reading Don't Fear the Reaper by Stephen Graham Jones, and he is an author that will sometimes write a sentence that is really awkwardly or unnaturally phrased, but he has demonstrated that he is an incredibly competent writer, so it feels like a deliberate choice rather than it being a mistake, and that's something that a lot of creepypastas miss out on. It can be easy to look at some of the criticisms towards a creepypasta or a no-sleep story and say that they are all just nitpicks, but it's because all of those things pile up to a bigger picture. In my Jeff the Killer video, I pointed out that Jeff stopping a kid's heart with a single punch is hilarious and ridiculous, and I got a few comments telling me that that's actually realistic. I guess you can stop someone's heart with a single punch, but I also don't know if the author really understood the biological mechanism behind it. I would really doubt that they did. So it feels like a mistake, like something absurd, because I don't know if I can believe that the author was actually being super clever and accurate in a story that describes a bottle of bleach as a thing of bleach. Anyways, sorry for this rant. I just think it's an important concept to understand. It's the responsibility of the author to build confidence in their writing ability with the reader. Because if you don't, then stylistic choices or more unclear plot details will come off as mistakes rather than being deliberate decisions. Back to the story now. Assuming this must be something of drastic importance, the surgeon had a pen and pad fetched so that the patient could write his message. It was simple. Keep cutting. Using the word fetch there makes me laugh for some reason. It just feels out of place. Also, the author missed a chance for a prime single sentence paragraph with keep cutting. The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic as well, although they had to be injected with a paralytic for the duration of the operation. Duration of the operation is another certified bar. Also, the paralytics are effective on them, but they didn't think about trying to use them before when they were restraining the patients. It seems like that should have been one of the first things that they tried. The surgeon found it impossible to perform the operation while the patients laughed continuously. We are getting into that totally disturbing territory that reminds me of just how hard old creepypastas would try to be messed up. Laughing while in extreme pain gives off the same vibe as hyper-realistic eyes. Once paralyzed, the subjects could only follow the attending researchers with their eyes. That and laugh, I guess. The paralytic cleared their system in an abnormally short period of time, and they were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak, they were again asking for the stimulant gas. The researchers tried asking why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped out their own guts, and why they wanted to be given the gas again. Only one response was given: I must remain awake. So now we know why the subjects are doing all of this. They don't want to be put back to sleep and now want to be awake forever. It's a strange premise, but I actually think it works pretty well. I think recontextualizing all of the self-mutilation that they have done as being methods they have taken to keep themselves from falling asleep is a really neat idea. If the story was implying that all of this was done for that one reason, then I think it would be more interesting though. Instead, we know that they were doing these things while under the effect of the stimulant gas that was keeping them awake. so tearing themselves apart isn't fully correlated to them wanting to stay awake. All 3 subjects' restraints were reinforced and they were placed back into the chamber awaiting determination as to what should be done with them. The researchers, facing the wrath of their military benefactors for having failed the stated goals of their project, considered euthanizing the surviving subjects. I'm curious to know what their stated goals would have been. We know that they were supposed to keep them awake for 30 days, and even though 2 of them have died, the other 3 have still remained awake, so I don't know if they really failed. The commanding officer, a former KGB agent, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected, but were overruled. I actually really like this plot point because if the military found out that keeping someone awake for 2 weeks turns them into a killing machine with super strength that can't feel pain, they would be all over that. The issue here is that this officer is a former KGB agent, which means that he was an agent for the Soviet Union, which undercuts the Russian military these people are in. It's also pretty impressive that he's a former KGB agent in the late 1940s, when the KGB wouldn't be invented until 1954. Maybe he's a time traveler? In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, all 3 stopped struggling the moment it was let slip that they were going to be back on the gas. Is that really that shocking? These guys have been literally begging and pleading for the gas for most of this story, so why are the researchers shocked that they're happy when they get what they want? It was obvious that at this point all 3 were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds with all of his might. First left, then right, then left again for something to focus on. The remaining subject was holding his head off his pillow and blinking rapidly. So at this point, the researchers were trying to keep them awake for as long as possible, but the researchers take time to put pillows and blankets on the cots this time around. They were pretty clear earlier in the story that the subjects didn't have any bedding, so I think it's a little strange that they would be given a place to sleep this time around. Having been the first to be wired for EEG, most of the researchers were monitoring his brainwaves in surprise. In surprise of what? Are they monitoring anything surprising, or is it a surprise that they're monitoring the subject's brainwaves? Does the subject not know? EEGs are pretty hard to forget about when you're hooked up to one, so it would be shocking if they weren't aware that they were being monitored. My guess is that they meant to say the researchers were monitoring his brain in anticipation. They were normal most of the time, but sometimes flatlined inexplicably. It looked as if he were repeatedly suffering from brain death before returning to normal. The phrase of suffering from brain death makes me laugh. Brain death is the medical definition of death, and it means there's like absolutely zero activity going on in your brain. It's actual death. So to say that you are suffering from death like it's some sort of disease is kind of funny. I wouldn't say the guy in this story whose throat got ripped out is suffering from death. As they focused on paper scrolling out of the brainwave monitor, only one nurse saw his eyes slip shut at the same moment his head hit the pillow. His brainwaves immediately changed to that of a deep sleep, then flatlined for the last time as his heart simultaneously stopped. I don't think the second instance of one of the subjects dying as soon as they fall asleep is necessary. It was pretty clear the first time around, and this clarification kind of feels like overkill. Also, how are they falling asleep if the gas is on? Is it not as effective as we thought? Again, I'd be willing to give this story the benefit of the doubt, but I don't know if it's earned that for me at this point. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in now, his brainwaves showing the same flatlines as the one who just died from falling asleep. Okay, so my bad. The chamber hasn't been sealed yet, and the gas hasn't been put back on. Did anyone else picture them being back in the chamber already? Maybe this is just melting my brain at this point. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside, as well as 3 researchers. One of the named 3 immediately drew his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes, then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. This kind of comes out of nowhere. Also, it's kind of strange that the researchers also have guns. I get that they work for the military, but this should have been established earlier. I mean, it's Chekhov's gun. It's one of the most established and famous horror tropes of all time. He pointed his gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to a bed, as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. "I won't be locked in here with these things. Not with you," he screamed at the man strapped to the table. "What are you?" he demanded. "I must know." I'll forgive this sudden burst of violence and insanity from the researcher. This would be a stressful situation, but it's a little strange that he wants to know, like, what they are exactly. They've obviously shown themselves to be super messed up and masochistic, but I don't know if asking what they are feels like a natural outburst from the researcher. The real reason this is here is because the author wants to set up the monologue that the spooky test subject is about to drop on us. Let's hear his bars. The subject smiled. "Have you forgotten so easily?" the subject asked. "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread. So head up to any aspiring horror authors out there. If you want your spooky monster to be scary and freaky and intimidating, don't have them talk like this. This monologue kills any sort of fear the story has been building up for me. The flowery Shakespearean language feels so out of place, and it's not nearly as cool as it thinks it is. I'm kind of on board with the idea that going to sleep keeps this horrifying monster inside of you from coming out, but that could have been explained in a way that doesn't undercut the horror of the story. I'm fine with these things talking, and I might even be okay with them explaining what they are to the audience, but I think this is just going way too far with it, and I can't excuse it. I also dislike the "have you forgotten so easily" line. Is it implying that we should remember that we all have these things inside of us because most people don't stay awake for almost a month on end? Again, I think this could have been done a lot better, and I'm not completely opposed to the creature explaining itself, but using the phrase "nocturnal haven where we cannot tread" is so cringy to me. It just sounds like it's trying way too hard to sound proper and spooky. It feels like the author cracked open the thesaurus and then tried to say the same thing over again, but just fancy this time. But we literally have 2 sentences left, so let's just finish this out, and then I'll give more of my thoughts about the story at the end. The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked out, "So nearly free." And that's the end of the story. Like I said at the top, I wanted to cover this one because I think it's often regarded as one of the best creepypastas, but I think it's flawed in so many ways. The flaws aren't as egregious as Jeff the Killer, but they are still there. Also, the flaws in Jeff the Killer make that story hilarious, while this one doesn't really have anything that makes it stand out besides the weird monologue at the end. I don't think it's totally incompetent. It's a fine piece of internet horror, but I do wonder if a lot of people that think this is a really good story maybe aren't familiar with horror literature. On this channel, I alternate between talking about internet horror and horror literature, and I get way more views on the internet horror videos, but the literature videos are important in my opinion. For years, when I was younger, I wasn't aware that there are so many horror novels that are well written and creepy and wholly original. I figured internet horror was like all there was. And I still love internet horror. I think the fact that anyone can write and share their work for free on the internet is amazing and has lowered the bar to entry in a really, really great way. Reading horror literature has made me much more aware of some of the flaws in these old stories, but it's also made me appreciate well-written internet horror so much more. I'm actually kind of nervous to see the reception that this video gets. I know the Jeff the Killer video wouldn't be controversial because most of us know that story is wild, but this is one that I used to really love, and I still have the core idea of it, but I think that the actual writing in the story doesn't do the premise justice. A book that feels kind of similar to this premise that I mentioned earlier is The Exorcist. It might seem like an odd comparison, but let me talk about it a little bit more. The Exorcist is about a girl with an unknown ailment that her mother and researchers try all sorts of medical experiments to diagnose, but it evades their understanding. The girl, Regan, starts doing creepier and creepier things until the characters are forced to accept that there is something supernatural going on that they cannot ignore. There are disturbing actions taken by Regan, most notably a scene involving her stabbing herself with a crucifix. It's very uncomfortable and very disturbing, and even worse when you consider it's a little girl who's doing this. We have Regan speaking in a different voice as the demon speaks through her, and the demon tries to trick the priests into believing that it's something that it isn't. And we have one of the priests giving an explanation as to what the demon is and what it's trying to accomplish in possessing Regan. Again, it might seem like an odd connection, but I think there's a lot of overlap, and I would say The Exorcist is just written much better and it never feels over the top. If you like the idea of the Russian sleep experiment but feel that it wasn't executed properly, then go read The Exorcist. It's one of the best horror books I've ever read in my opinion. I'd also love to know what you guys think about the Russian sleep experiment. Do you think I'm way off in my assessment of its quality? Do you think I'm being too nice to it? Also, if there's another creepypasta you'd like to see me do a literary analysis of, then please let me know in the comments below. There's one called Magic 8 Ball that I want to do next. It's not very well known, but I read it for my creepypasta iceberg video, and I thought it was hilarious. It has a lot of strange writing quirks that we talked about in Jeff the Killer. And for a final time, these videos are not meant to make fun of someone who took the initiative to put their work out there for the world to see. I think that is always admirable. I just like talking about the little details that can pile up to make a story either more or less impactful, and I hope that any authors watching consider some of the advice that I gave in this video. But that's going to do it for this one. If you can't tell, I'm kind of losing my voice. This has been like an hour and a half long recording, which is kind of long for me, and I just sit at home and don't talk to anybody except for my bird, so I'm not used to using my voice this much. Thanks so much for watching, and please let me know what stories you'd like to see me cover next in the comments. If you're interested in horror literature, then please check out any of my literature videos. I just made one on a collection of short found footage horror stories called Found. If you haven't seen my Jeff the Killer analysis yet, then go watch it. It's one of my best performing videos, and and it was a ton of fun to make. If you haven't subscribed yet, then please do that. I'm trying to hit 50,000 subs by the end of 2025, and I would love to have you here in the community. If you'd like to support me further, then please consider becoming a channel member where you'll get access to exclusive videos, access to my Discord, early access to all my videos, and access to my members-only book club. A massive thank you to all my gold tier members: Amanda Mapes, Lucas Fernando, Chris Lamb, Ezra, Silent Trails, Blue Radio Media, Tyler the Leper, Vix Corner, Miss Joy 16, Coco Boko, Cherry Shark, Saddest John, Moonsong Blog, Starlight Pink, Jack Zamora, Amanda Castillon, Lexi, Arcade Link Author, Pyrocat, B, The Official Gar, Passion the Fruit, Ybab Flow, Hi, Zapodapos, Semra, Laura Gonzalez, Flora Paz, Rafael Sampao, Classic Pats Games Plus, Miranda M, Lemonade Slug, Heat O'Brien, and Ben Best. And because I did this at the end of my last video, I wanted to hide an extra little story for you guys at the end of this video in case you've made it all the way to the very end. Last time I talked about a horrifying YouTube video that I was sent by somebody and I hid the comment so I can't find that video anymore. But I want to talk about an insane, scary dream that I had years ago that I still think about to this day. And it was like me, and it was back when I was in high school. And it was me, and I was in a house, and I was like being showed this house by a realtor. But in the house, there was a ghost, and it was this lady. She had this very specific face where it was like these two hollow eyes and this hollow mouth, and she would just like stare at me like super freaky like. But anyway, in the dream, we like banished her out from the house, doing something. I don't remember what happened, but then at the very end of the dream, I looked out the window and I could see in like it was so weird, it was like in the bushes, I could see the outline of her face like made up in the bushes, and it freaked me out. And I heard this big like musical sting, and then I woke up and I could still hear that musical sting. It was crazy. And then I went to school after that, and I was looking out the window in one of my classrooms, and I swear I looked out to the bushes and I saw that exact same like leaf amalgamation of her face with the eyes and the mouth and everything, and it was so freaky, and I've not forgotten it to this day. But anyway, thank you so much for watching to the very end of this video. For all my channel members, your support really does mean the world to me. It's been super fun talking to all you guys in the Discord and getting recommendations for books and videos and music and all that good stuff. And thanks again to everybody for watching this video, and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.